Guys, the tariffs are up. Your mom's $90. Hey, everybody, what's up? Welcome back to the Gamescade. Today, and only today, we are here to have a little fun discussion video that that's been on my mind the last few days because of how Twitter's been and everything. And that is the age-old conversation of Mario versus Sonic. Now, I wanted to talk about this just because there's been a lot of discussion about it on the timeline stuff. I figured, it's been a minute since we've done like a chill discussion video like this. So, of course, as always, make sure to subscribe to your boy. Make sure to support the content. Become a YouTube member. You're going to get a good exclusive video this week, as well as usually every week. And yeah, so lock in. But yeah, so the reason this conversation came up was because essentially, obviously with all the stuff going on with Mario, and Mario Kart World versus Sonic Crossroads, there's been a lot of conversation that sparked. Like a lot of people being like, well, I actually still think Sonic Crossroads looks better, right? You have some people being like, oh, well, this game's going to be cheaper than the other one. You have people being like, well, look at the polish on Mario, look at, look, literally Mario taking stuff from Sonic, like the grind railing or even like the on water, instead of being underwater, kind of like an All-Stars rating. So it just sparked up that conversation. And then it sparked up the conversation of, Sonic team versus Mario dev team, and all this stuff across, the industry and everything. So I figured, it'd be fun to just talk about why I think, right? And this is my opinion. This is me, spinning things in a positive way, as I like to often. I think Mario versus Sonic conversations are a good thing. I think ultimately it is a positive thing. Now, obviously, if you go on the depths of the internet, you're always going to find some bad apples and stuff like that. But there's a reason why I think it's a good thing, right? For the longest time, right, when, I would say like around the 2010s, that conversation kind of died, right? I feel like there was a point where people stopped comparing Mario and Sonic, and it just became like, there was no competition, right? There was no conversation about it, right? Obviously, you think back to the original roots, right, of the 90s, where, Sonic was made, and there was like a rivalry between Mario and Sonic. And even then, that rivalry, while, between the companies was a little toxic, ultimately, it led to good playground discussion, right? It led to, games wanting to one-up each other, right? Whether it was in even commercials, right? Where like Sega does what Nintendo don't and all that stuff. Like, I feel like there was a lot in that, original debate in the 90s that really led to these games fighting for, better quality, more fanfare and all this stuff. And even in the 2000s, I mean, yeah, there was a lot of Mario games, but there was a lot of Sonic games. I mean, the 2000s was as the pinnacle of getting a shit ton of Sonic games, right? You were getting the adventure games at that point. You were getting them even ported to Nintendo consoles, right? I felt like that was a big moment where a lot of Nintendo fans started experiencing Sonic and getting, that sort of, look at both worlds. But then obviously, the 06 thing happens, then you get that shift, right, where, you get like the 06, versus Galaxy at the time that came out a year later, which is crazy. And then it sort of felt like as the time went on, the conversation shifted. Now, obviously, you have your moments. It's funny, and I wonder how you guys feel. Let me know in the comment section below. I always have a hard time comparing like which Mario and Sonic game I would pit against each other, right? Because you could think like Sonic 1 versus Mario 1. I feel like I could give it to, Mario 1 there, at least, on an industry standpoint, even though I think Sonic 1 is fun to play. I think Mario 2 versus Sonic 2, by far I would give that to Sonic 2. Mario 3 versus Sonic 3 and Knuckles, see, that's a tough one. I think I prefer Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but I adore Mario World, And then if you want to do like, I guess CD versus World, but I guess maybe you would do like Sonic CD versus Mario 2, because now CD is the second Sonic game technically that they count. So there's debate between those ones. Then you go into the adventure games. I don't think it's arguable. I mean, I like adventure more than 64, but I know a lot of people love 64. But the point stands that it felt like there was a big debate, and then as time went on and we started getting stuff like your Lost Worlds, your Forces, your what would you even say at that? But I guess like all the spin-offs, your Black Knights and Secret Rings. I guess with Generations you could argue that was pretty good. But like I said, it felt like the conversation died for a hot minute, right? Where it just felt like Mario was on top. But now I do think that ever since Frontiers, the conversation's been brought back up again, right? I even think like a game like Team Sonic Racing lost the footing in terms of like a racing game being better conversation wise, right? Because I feel like with All Stars Racing and All Stars Transform, it felt like people were like, oh shit, these games are fucking awesome. You know, like these games stand toe to toe with Mario Kart in their own way, right? But then Team Sonic Racing comes out and ruins that conversation. So now that we've actually gotten to try Sonic Racing Crossroads and people are getting to try Mario Kart World, obviously we need both games to come out before, final conclusions. But I think the fact that these two games are stirring conversations tells me that they're both doing something interesting and fun, right? Like on one end, you have, when I've been looking at both of these games, right? It's like with Mario Kart World, I feel like you have the evolution of the kart racer, right? Like you have, all right, let's do free roam. Let's take, what Forza Horizon does, but, Mario Fire, where you have an open world where you can run around with friends. All the tracks are these interconnected wonders, but at the same time, like interconnected tracks, limits you, right? Because you can't have, you can't have like crazy randomness. There needs to be some cohesion, right? Whereas with something like Sonic Racing Crossroads, right, every track you do, when you get to the second lap, boom, you're in a different crossroad, right? And it's more arcadey, it's more chaotic, right? You have I feel like the way I describe it is like Mario Kart, you have more of like a karting game experience, whereas like with Sonic Racing, it's way more arcade like. I feel like I'm in an arcade booth, playing something that's high speed. You can change all the car parts and everything. Like, and there's something very arcadey about the feel of Crossroads. And, we haven't even seen Extreme Gear yet for that game, right? And I'm sure there's a lot with Mario Kart we haven't seen. We'll be live reacting to that direct when it happens. But the fact that I feel like both of these games stand out incredibly well next to each other is awesome. I mean, I was going back and watching some of my footage of Crossroads and I was like, damn, bro, I missed this shit. I miss playing this, right? And so then you have the people online starting conversations being like, oh, like a Mario game, a Sonic game will never beat the level of a Mario game. And I'm like, and then you have some people be like, well, Shadow Gens happened. And I kind of agree. Like Shadow Gens for me was a big turning point, right? Where, you guys can argue about it, right? With Shadow Gens, that was, I feel like, a game that I guess we could compare Shadow Gens to Bowser's Fury, right? That would be like the perfect example because they're both like included in a package, right? And even honestly, if you were to just compare the whole package, I mean, 3D World compared to Sonic Generations, I feel like those are two debatable games, right? Like I don't think that's an obvious one where like, oh, Mario takes this one. I feel like Sonic Generations is amazing. It's an amazing game and an amazing Sonic game. It's not one of just those like, if you like Sonic, you'll like Gens. I feel like Gens is universally beloved. Whereas like, if anything, 3D World, a lot of people resent because it takes the series, to a smaller scale, right? But then you have something like the Bowser's Fury, right? Versus a Shadow Gens. And man, those are two incredibly polished experiences. I mean, I would venture to say that Shadow Gens is probably the most polished modern Sonic game we've ever got. There's no real bugs in it at all. Like the game is just pure polish. It's got cinematics mid-level. Like I like it more than Bowser's Fury, and I think Bowser's Fury is really cool. You guys can let me know which one you prefer in the comments in the section below. But yeah, like I feel like with a game like Shadow Generations, we've finally seen, I feel like, Sonic Team polish, because there's something that people do that I always get confused about, where they're like, oh, look at Sonic Frontiers, that we're gonna need the sequel to know that they learned. And I'm like, bro, like Shadow Gens is right there. It's a game that came out a few years after Frontiers, 2 years exactly. And look how clean it is. Look how polished it is. There's no real bugs in it. There's no weird jank in it. Like it is pure, like platforming bliss. You've got great challenge missions, you've got great main levels, you've got a fun narrative, you've got like a beautiful looking game to it. The environments, like, they fucking cooked. Obviously, it's a game that it's still an anniversary game, so it's a lot of old levels that we're seeing again, so we have to see them make new stuff. But for the most part, like, they made new level layouts and everything, so that team knows what they're doing. And so, like I said, I think that the point is to say for me that, like, with the debate, I'm glad it's a debate, right? Because, I adore Mario too, right? Like, I think Mario is fantastic. I often think of my time with Mario Odyssey versus Sonic Frontiers. This is a video I wanted to do for a while, but I don't think I ever got to, right? Whereas like with Mario Odyssey versus Frontiers, I'd struggle a lot of times, right? Because I think of when I think of those two games side by side, I go like, all right, well, with Mario, you get, phenomenal polish, right? You get a lot of varied areas. You got like Luncheon Kingdom, the Desert Kingdom, you get the moon, you get New Donk. Like, I feel like environmentally fantastic, right? Content-wise, you get a lot, right? But I feel like, when I play a game like Sonic Frontiers, right, I get, that cool sense of speed, right? I love the cyberspace levels. I think the music is fantastic. I think, the bosses are the coolest shit ever, right? Like, I feel like stuff like that really helps, whereas again with Odyssey, you get like a polished, really well executed, really well done Mario platformer, where like, you could argue a lot of the moons are not memorable, but there's a lot more care and love put into it because they had more money, more research. But again, there's a conversation to be had there about which someone can prefer. Like, you could really like Sonic Frontiers more than Odyssey. You could really like Odyssey. Now, obviously, you can like any game more than the other, right? But I think we could all agree and come to a consensus that like we're at a point where like there's a conversation where it's like, if you compare like, Sonic 06 to Galaxy, it's like a no-brainer, right? Because of what happened with 06, right? Or you could argue, with something like Lost World versus, I guess, like, what would you compare it to 3D World at the time, or even 3D Land? Like, I guess, polish-wise, Lost World is there, but I feel like even quality and everything-wise, 3D World Land takes it, right? But that's my point, is that we're at that point of that discussion. I think is really healthy. We've even had a Sonic team recently say, like, one of the directors saying, like, we want to be at the level of Mario, right? Like, they say it, straight up say it themselves. Like, we know that Mario, at the end of the day, especially mainline Mario, is Nintendo's baby. That's the one they put the most love into, the most care into. And I feel like Sonic team wants to do that with Sonic, but for the longest time, I think they just weren't allocated time or fair budget, but now that we're seeing we're even seeing like box office success here, right? Like, think about how many debates and conversations you saw about the Mario movie and Sonic movie. And again, like I said, there's always going to be people online that go like, there's no way you're comparing the Sonic movie to the Mario movie, right? But there's a lot of people that say like, there's no way comparing Mario to Sonic, because I think they both have their pros and cons, right? Like, I think, again, with Mario movie, you get this, like, beautifully animated movie, right? But a lot of people say that, pacing is too fast, story is, like, basically whatever, right? But they pay, attention to the music and everything, right? Whereas, like, with something like the Sonic movie, you have, like, a plot that feels a lot more cohesive. You have, these crazy set pieces. It's way more, like, raw in terms of its energy, right? But with Mario, you get, like, here's eye candy, but it is really, really good eye candy. But it's the fact that we're in that debate point. Obviously, mainstream wise, Mario at $1 billion at a box office, Sonic at a 500 million, right? But that's still huge. I mean, that's still huge that we're at the point where, like, hey, Sonic's halfway there. Sonic's at that halfway point with Mario, right? Obviously Mario's always going to have more popularity, but the fact that we're even getting to that point where that conversation is happening is really fucking cool. And of course, like, I want these things to encourage each other, right? Like, I want, the Paramount or Sega or whatever to look at the Mario movie and be like, damn, we should make, in the future an animated Sonic movie, right? And I would love if, the Mario team, like, when, like, all right, well, look how crazy the shit they're doing in Sonic movie is. Like, they're really going over the top here. And even, take from that if they wanted to, right? And obviously even with Sonic movie, I feel like they took from the Mario movie where they're like, okay, let's try to finally have some of the video game music incorporated in this, right? And like I said, as we look into the future of what's next for 3D Sonic versus 3D Mario, I am so unbelievably excited, right? Because I feel like I genuinely in my heart of hearts think the next 3D Sonic game is going to look phenomenal. I think it's gonna be fantastic. If Shadow Gens is any indication, what they did in Frontiers is any indication, like, where that team is headed is, like, really high up, especially with the budget increase and everything they've had, right? And I feel like I said, it's a good thing that we're back to this conversation, because it means that quality is getting up there where people can at least fairly talk about it, right? And I love that, right? Even on a spin-off basis, right? I like the idea that, dude, the fact that we're out here talking about Crossroads versus Mario Kart World is fucking awesome. Like, I'm looking at this on a positive. I'm like, dude, this is 2K cakes, right, that I'm eating here, right? But there's differences between them, you know. With one, I'm looking at, I feel like the evolution of a kart racer, right? What it can do. You know, at the other one, I'm looking at something that looks really fucking fun and is super arcadey. And they both have their pros and they're both going to be so fun in their own ways. But I love that they're driving each other. You know, to me, like, that's what Mario and versus Sonic is to me, is that it's not who can beat the other and make the other look like shit. It's like who can encourage the other to do something cool. Because, like, I mean, it's possible it isn't, right? But we're not going to sit here and pretend that, like, you know, the cow doing the rail grinding isn't somewhat Sonic inspired, right? I feel like a lot of games that do rail grinding nowadays, like, are inspired by Sonic in that sense, right? Like, there's little things. Again, even the water, right? Like, they ditched going underwater for Mario Kart, and now it's going to be, like, hovering, which, you know, they were doing that in Sonic All-Stars, Racing Transform, right? I feel like, you know, that was inspired by it, right? And in the same way, you know, Crossroads gets inspired by having more, you know, luscious environments, you know, more drift levels, all this stuff. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff. Even like in Mario Kart World, there's a clip going around of like Pauline doing the bunch of tricks in the air, which you can do in Sonic Racing, right? And like I said, I feel like even when you compare Shadow Gens to Bowser's Fury, very similar environments, like very just white environments with some platforming segments and all that stuff. Now, I would like for us to get to a point where you don't have to go to a different level within an open zone. Like in Shadow Gens in Frontiers, you basically have to go to another spot to access the platforming level, whereas we're at the point with Mario where like the platforming section is the open environment. And so I would like Sonic to do that for the next game, but I'd understand if they'd want to do different environments. That's all conversation about what I'd like to see from Frontiers 2, right? But on that note, like I said, these comparisons are happening and I want to see more, right? Yeah, it's especially sad now that we don't have an actual game between them with Mario vs. Sonic at the Olympics, or Mario and Sonic at the Olympics, that I'd like to see them cross over again. And I would love to see, you know, Sega or Sonic Team attempt a Smash-like, if anything. You know, it'd be cool to see a Sonic Smash-like game or even just a fighting game to, you know, to compete and have their own thing. We have Sonic Rumble coming out, which is, but that's going to be more of like a Fall Guys-like. That's not really comparable to anything. I guess with Mario Party, you have that mode called Coupathlon, right? Which I guess would be the equivalent of it. But it's cool to see these two franchises thriving. It's like I've grown up loving both of these. Obviously, here I cover Sonic extensively. It's my baby. It's what I care about the most, right? But I've always loved Mario, and I always will love Mario. And I strive for, like, you know, the next 2D Sonic game to be like Mario Wonder, right? Like Mario Wonder is so colorful, imaginative, and creative, whereas Sonic Superstars was like, all right, this plays well, but it's very safe, right? It's a very safe bet. It's like, here's some, you know, standard environments, but it controls well. Whereas if we can get to a point with the next 2D Sonic where Sonic Team's inspired to be like, man, I think we got to start like being really creative here with a potential art style or whatever, I'll take that. I mean, dude, like Sonic Mania is fucking awesome, right? Like I would argue a Sonic Mania is better than a lot of, like, you know, the new Super Mario Bros. Games. I think a lot of people would agree with that. It's like they have the potential to make good shit and crazy shit. We always see glimpses of it. And I feel like that's where people even bring that conversation, is we see glimpses, right? Like Shadow Gens is a glimpse of what they can do, right? But that's, you know, a smaller scale project. Mania is a glimpse of what a 2D Sonic can truly be at its peak potential. But again, smaller title as well, right? And so with Frontiers, we saw a AAA Sonic game, right, where it was close, but you can tell like it was in the oven still, right? Like obviously I adore Frontiers. You guys know I love that game. That game is my baby. But it's one of those things where with Frontiers, that's a game that could have used, you know, more work. And, you know, it did, because it got DLC for over a year. Now you could argue Frontiers, much better game. You know, it's got like it's action, combat, its platforming is better. You've got stuff like it's Spin Dash, but I don't think it's there yet, right? But I feel like Shadow Gens really gives you a good preview, right? And I feel like as someone who's grown up my entire life playing both of these series, right, and enjoying them for everything they are, everything they've done, right? It's really, I'm happy seeing comparisons happen again, because to me, like we've always talked about this, healthy competition is good. It drives you. Healthy competition makes you want to be better than the other. You know, to bring this weirdly out of this conversation, you think of right now the Xbox situation, right? Because Xbox isn't in the conversation anymore, really. Like they're still around, but they're not really a mainstay. PlayStation basically won that conversation. And because of that, like, they can kind of do any decision they want, you know, for better or worse. Like they can just kind of getting away with like, oh, we can take our time with our games. We don't have to do too much because people are just buying our games here. Whereas, you know, it felt like in the PS3 era or even early PS4 era, I guess, there was more of a competitive drive to do big moves, right? To do big changes because, well, you were still competing and you wanted to one up the other. And when two people want to one-up each other, that encourages them to be better, right? Because like if I'm at the top, I'm not competing anymore. I can chill. I can vibe. Whereas if there's something to always strive for and want to be better at, you know, and then taking something from the other person and learning from them and adapting, there's always that engagement. I love healthy competition. And I think in video games, it's especially healthy. You see it even beyond Mario and Sonic, right? You see it in platformers in general. You see it with fighting games, right? Fighting games always want to be, you know, what if I could do this mechanic this fighting game did and make it better? And so to see that with a franchise like, you know, Mario and Sonic, which are both platforming, and they've, listen, I feel like we compare them, but they are so different too, right? Like with Sonic, it is a high-speed obstacle course that thrives on its, you know, style and its unique environments and zones and everything. Whereas with Mario, I feel like oftentimes it's like these safe environments, but they are a incredibly well-made obstacle course, right? With Mario, it's like an incredibly well-made course that someone has made for you, right? Whereas with Sonic, like obviously there's like good courses, but it's like it's about learning, right? Like I think of the boost games. I think of even replaying Unleashed recently when we all have like learning those levels in Unleashed it's so like a level flow of a Sonic game is so different from a level flow of a Mario game, right? Like when I think of, you know, what's a good comparison? When I think of a level like 3D World, right, or where it's just like this miniature level that's really fun to go through, I'm just having a casual time. Whereas when I think of like an Unleashed level or a Generations level, it's a level where I'm boosting through. I gotta, you know, time my jump at the right moment. If I jump here, I get to the higher path, right? If I stay at the higher path and don't fall down, I'm going through, right? You know, quick step, so I don't fall. Like there is so many things like, you know, where I'm doing quick reflexes and reactions and literally learning the level by heart. Whereas with Mario, I'm kind of taking these nice jaunts through these levels and enjoying, you know, what they've made and the little ideas they have in each pocket of every level. So it's a very different gameplay state. So in that sense, I don't ever compare them directly gameplay wise, but I do like to compare them in terms of, okay, well, what can one do from the other, you know, that, you know, would be great. Like I think of with Mario, something I saw on Twitter today is like vocal tracks, right? You know, where Odyssey finally started having vocal tracks in a mainline Mario game, right? Or even I would say style. Like Sonic has always to me thrived and done better when it comes to the stylistic aspect and even like memorable levels, right? When you think of like the original Mario games, there's like maybe one or two levels you remember by heart, but with Sonic games you remember zones. You're like, oh, I love Chemical Plant, I love Sky Sanctuary, I love, you know, Rooftop Run, I love the Spagonia area, you know, well, that is Rooftop Run, sorry. You know, I love Tropical Resort, right? Whereas like with Mario, right, you think of typically like the journey more than the main levels themselves, you know, especially this applies more to classic Mario where like it's a lot of like, all right, I'm in the sand area, I'm in the desert area, I'm in the water area. Whereas, you know, in classic Sonic, you like, oh my God, you're always going to remember, you know, a Metallic Madness, a Sky Sanctuary, a Hydro City. Like those are so much more, you know, memorable. But when it comes to 3D, I mean, people often remember their favorite galaxies in Mario Galaxy. It's a whole different flow, but I just love that it's a conversation. I know I'm going, you know, I feel like I've made my points here, but all this to say, even for you guys, when you're having a conversation about online, try looking at it from a point of like, well, what can these two take from each other and learn from each other, right? And how can these things be better thanks to each other? Because, dude, the idea that a Mario game should learn something from a Sonic game sounds fucking awesome to me. I feel like that has barely happened or needed to happen, sadly, but I want to get to that point, right? Where a Mario game has to look at something a Sonic game did and be like, that's a really fucking good idea. How do we, you know, Marioify that, right? How do we do something with that? That's gonna be interesting to me the day we see stuff like that, because we kind of see it a bit in Crossroads, like I said, with the rail grinding and the wall running even, right? But it'll be cool to see when the mainline games try to take a little bit more of that style and, you know, gameplay and everything, you know, especially when you think of the 2000s that were really experimental, right? Like you have a game like Sunshine, which is super weird and experimental with its controls, versus a game like even Sonic Adventure, where, like, you know, you have mech levels and all this stuff. So I know it's a different ball game, but I'm so fucking happy that we're at that point where we could talk about these two in a fun manner. So guys, thank y'all for watching. Let me know what you all thought in the comment section below. I figured we'd have like a little yap session like this. And of course, I love you, and I'll see you all next time. Peace out.